Hi, Krista.
Hi.
I'm excited to be talking about the DISC today. What would you call this? A personality assessment or a profile? Um, is there a great specific descriptor for the DISC?
Yeah, it's a assessment tool
Uh-huh.
um, that measures personal behavior that impacts communication. That's
Okay.
that's literally what they say that it is. It's a scientific measure of behavior that really impacts how we are moving through the world with other people, because how we do that is through communication. So it's it's powerful. It's a powerful tool.
hmm And you are a little bit of an expert on it. So we are going to reap all of your wisdom. And I feel so fortunate to be having this conversation with you with our listeners because you have introduced me to this tool. And the reason we are talking about it is because we need to have some self awareness as we move through the world. And this is a tool to help us. It also helps us understand other people. And of course, the better we understand other people, the better we're going to be able to adapt and respond and give them what they need and choose our own words or behaviors. Uh, but there is another part to it when we are getting to know ourselves. Sometimes there are parts of us that we just don't love, right? That's the reality. That we're going to be talking about 4 types today. And there may be a type that you think, oh, yeah, that sounds like me, but I don't love that that sounds like me. I wish I was more like this one over here. And we just want to call that out right away. Say that that's normal. I'm going to have some confessions in here that I don't always love my type. And we are going to celebrate each type as well, because God has wired us in unique ways. And we are uniquely called into certain spaces, whether that's at work or within a family system, within a church, a school board, whatever group you're part of, you have influence. And the way that you're wired impacts how you carry out that influence in the world. So we are going to recognize and just name that sometimes we don't love how we're wired. And we're going to affirm in each other that the way God has wired us can be used for his good and his glory. And he still has given us agency. And so you're going to be talking with each type about kind of what our natural tendencies are and where we might need to be careful, but also where we can grow. Just that self-awareness allows us to have some choice in those things too, when we know this is my natural bent. And if I don't want to respond that way, then I need to have some conscious thoughts in how to respond. So that's why we're talking about this. And I'm very excited about it. We are going to eventually be talking about it specifically within the workplace. But for today, let's start with just talking about the DISC in general. So give us another, maybe more specific overview of what the DISC is and why it is helpful.
Yeah, I love what you were just talking about. I mean, one, that God made us how he made us, and we get to celebrate that. And also, I mean, study after study on leadership shows that it's not one type that is the best leader. It's actually the most self-aware types that are the best leaders. So any type can be a leader. And the more self-aware you are, the better leader you are going to be. Whether you're leading in the workplace, you're leading at home with a family, you're leading by coaching a soccer team or leading a classroom, whatever areas and arenas you are leading, the more self-aware you are, the better equipped you are to be the most effective leader you can be. And the DISC is really, well, it's the leading assessment for businesses. It's used by over 40 million people. And it really does develop inspiring leadership because of this self-awareness piece. It helps people to recognize what their personal behaviors are that are impacting communication. And like you asked, is it a personality test? It's actually not a personality test. It's an assessment of behaviors. And here's what it helps people do. It helps people to know how they respond in conflict. It helps them to realize what causes stress, because sometimes we feel stressed, but we don't know why we feel stress. So it
Yes.
helps them to identify why they feel stress, what would be triggering that. It keeps them motivated. It helps them figure out how they approach problems. Again, how stress is created is often around problems. So it helps us to know and identify how are we even approaching problems, and it helps a person to know how they make decisions. And all of this creates the self-awareness. So the goal is that each person would learn about themselves and then also about the preferences and patterns of other people around them on their team. Again, your team is whoever you're with, whether that's workplace, family, classroom, church, who's on your team. But it helps you to be able to identify your style, but also the other people on your team. And then to learn how to adapt your style going forward with others and develop actionable strategies to inspire the people around you and to also harness the potential of people around you. And this increases your influence, which is what we hope. We hope as leaders, we can have positive influence. So when we operate in patterns, whether we know it or not, we actually function best when we can see patterns and respond to that. So I often use like a picture of a leopard or a zebra and say, okay, when you see these stripes, what do you think of? Well, that's a zebra. And so when we learn these personality types, we start to see patterns and we can respond more quickly. Oh, that's a zebra. What that means is that I can respond this way to that animal. I'm not saying people are animals, but what I'm saying is when we start to develop those patterns and we can recognize those quicker, then not only can we respond differently ourselves, but we can say, okay, this person needs that. And this is going to help me to interact with them in a different way. You and I have used this tool and it really has helped us because I can say, okay, here's Alex's pattern. And so I can then be sensitive to how you communicate and how you operate. And it helps me know how to communicate with you better. And that just creates a better team. So the Carnegie Institute, they have done studies on what makes a person successful, and their findings show that 15% is technical skill and 85% is people skills.
Okay, let's just pause there for a second. Because I think for a lot of our listeners, this may be good news, right? They may feel like I'm pretty good with people skills, but it's also why we want to focus on this, because this helps with our people skills. And I also want to clarify something you said about patterns. So we may all exhibit behaviors that are associated with all four of the types at different times, right? But they may not be our go-to pattern. So when we are looking at ourselves and at other people, we're looking at it over time and things that consistently come back. Is that right?
Yes. And again, this is just information. We're not labeling it as good or bad. And that's actually an important piece of the DISC, is that one type is not good or bad. Every type is great, and every type has its growth areas. And so we can actually, when we say pattern, it just means what is our natural bent. And these are probably things that have been in us from birth. Honestly, it's that nature aspect of us, of how we were made, what God has stamped on us, and ultimately what we can harness for the benefit of good in the world.
Yeah. And just thinking from parents' perspective, you have 2 children, 3 children, 4 children, all born with the same genetic pool into the same household. And you ask yourself, how can they be so different? And sometimes we attribute it to birth order. And I think that can influence, right? But a lot of it is just, we say as parents, they were just born this way. And so this may help us too, as we are wondering, why is this person wired this way? This may just help clarify some of the wiring, and then again, help us to love them well.
Well, and the disc really says there are three things that impact your disc type. And the first one is how you're born, just what you're literally born into the world with, what your background, so your childhood and what shapes you, and your experiences. And those things together create who you are. And those things together create your disc.
So does that mean it can change over time? Because if your experiences are influencing it, your experiences change over time.
Yes. And yet at the same time, we probably will default to our same disc type. I mean, I will get there, but I'm not going to morph into, for example, this one type of C. I'm not going to morph into a C. Now, can I challenge myself to have more of what a C is by doing certain things? Yes. But will I become a C? No, I'm never going to be a C.
Okay. And we'll get to what a C is, what we're talking about in just a minute. Okay. So the quality of our life is determined by the quality of our communication. That's a big statement. And this helps us not only understand people's responses, but then how they communicate those responses.
Yes. Yeah. So the disc, I mean, what we're going to learn today is 1, our tendencies, 2, our priorities, 3, our behaviors, and 4, our language. So I think those are tendencies, priorities, behaviors, language. Those are the 4 things that we're going to talk about.
Okay.
And can I just say, this isn't designed to put you in a box. Whenever there's an assessment, you get to boss the test. The test doesn't boss you. You get to cross out things that aren't true of you. I'm going to say some things today about the types. Like, these are growth areas. Maybe some of these are growth areas for you. Maybe some aren't. So you just get to say what is and what isn't. And so I really want to encourage, if you're the kind of person that says, I don't take those because it puts me in a box, this is just a tool, and you get to boss the tool. You get to decide when you pull it out and when you don't. So you don't have to feel restrained by that. I also want to say this helps round out some of the other assessments you may have taken. So, Alex, I would love to hear how you have experienced that with the DISC.
Well, I've wondered as I've been looking at this, if certain Enneagram types, for example, tend to fall under certain DISC types, because there seem to be some response behaviors or values, priorities, I guess you would call them, that trickle in. So I think for me, I have realized how I respond to other types on the DISC, learning about my DISC type, but then also learning about other DISC types and how my type tends to respond. It wasn't surprising. It was affirming. And it also explained, it's not that I don't love certain personalities. It's just that this is my natural, innate response to them. And so I think it just has helped me in my awareness to be like, oh, I'm feeling pushed right now. And when I feel pushed, this is how I tend to respond. And so I need to be aware that, is this kind of response back what I want to give this person? Or can I check myself and say, that's not really the way I want to respond right now. So I have to consciously think through it. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, these are good tools, especially I think for interacting with other people. Whereas the Enneagram for me feels more like it explains maybe some of my isolated behaviors, like, I don't know, maybe how I'm responding to situations or circumstances that aren't necessarily relationship focused. And this to me really helps me a little more with relationships.
Mhm. Yeah. I think too, when we're looking at it in light of, for example, the Enneagram, you may have two people that are the same number and you're like, they move through the world totally differently. How
Mm.
in the world can they be the same number? Well, it's because the Enneagram deals in motivation,
Mhm.
but the DISC deals in behavior. So those people may have the same motivation. They actually want the same thing, but how it plays out in their personalities and in their communication style is really different because their DISC helps explain that of
Mhm.
why they maybe move through the world. And so you're like, how can they both be a 6? How can they
Mhm.
both be a 2? Well, it's because their DISC is really different.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. That's a good answer. Um, well, let's talk about it. So there's 4 personality types, and DISC is an acronym, right? DISC. So we're going to talk
Mhm.
about each of the types in relation to one of those letters. So when you referenced a C earlier, it's because that is one of the types. So let's go through them in that order, DISC. And why don't you school us on each one? So let's start with D. What does D stand for?
D stands for dominant. So they are only 3% of the population. The characteristics of D are they seek control, they're decisive, they're direct, and they're results oriented or task oriented. So they're driven by authority. They easily take charge in any group. They embrace any change that will help them get results. So they are not change averse. In fact, they lean into change, especially when it's going to get them where they want to go. They're very comfortable responding to direct confrontation and they treasure loyalty. So, some things you may find with this type are they're bold, they're confident, they thrive on resistance, they're goal oriented. They're, like I said, comfortable leading. They motivate others to action. They excel in emergencies. They're productive, they're decisive, and they're persistent. So, can you think of someone in your life right now in your head that that is
Mm-hmm.
the prototype of that?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's actually really helpful as we're going through these. Like, think of someone in your life who is like this type. That helps you to kind of wrap your brain around the type.
Mm-hmm. And can I just clarify before we get too deep into this? I remember when we took the assessment, when I took it with you, that um, I could rank high or low on each of these, but when somebody is a D, that doesn't mean they don't have other qualities.
Right.
And someone may be what you call a high D versus a low D. So can you explain that there's not just
Mhm.
one D, that you can, um, when you take the assessment, you can assess more strongly on D than maybe somebody who has maybe a little bit lower.
Yes. So there's what we call in the middle an energy line. And
Okay.
if you test above the energy line, that means you lean into that type. If you
Okay.
test below the energy line on that type, it means you are you the least you are like that type. So for example, and can we use you as an example?
Yes.
Would you
Use
mind?
me as an
Okay.
example.
So remind me of where your D was. I know you were below the energy line on D, but I
Mhm.
can't remember how far you were.
I can't remember either.
Okay.
Um, but probably pretty low.
Yeah, I think if I'm remembering correctly, I
Mhm.
can't remember exactly where it was, but if I'm remembering, it was pretty far below the energy line on
Mhm.
D,
Mhm.
which simply means that the further you are away from that energy line, the less you are like this type, the
Mhm.
less you embody the characteristics of this type. So this is not going to be, you're not going to necessarily be bringing these strengths to the table on a team.
Mhm. Yes, true.
Does that make sense? Does that clarify that?
Yes. Yes. So for a given person, so I ranked really high on one. I ranked a little bit above the energy line on another.
Mhm.
And then
Yes.
on 2 of them, I ranked below the energy line. And so that combination is going to be unique to each person, and where they are as far as above or below the energy line on each of them is going to be different. Okay.
Right. And the more extreme you are, the more you're
Mhm.
bringing that type to
Yes.
the table. And the more you have to have more self awareness. So,
Mm.
for example, in stress, I go to a really high D in stress. So, I'm not going to get too into the weeds on this, but there's 3 different graphs which show that you kind of operate differently in different spaces. But one of them is your stress response. So when I get stressed, my go-to is to take control. And so because I want to, right, control the situation. And so like normally my D is a little bit lower, but in stress it goes really high. So that plays into it too, of we may in stress really go high in one of the letters.
Okay, great. Okay, that was just our pause in the middle of D. So let's go back to D.
Okay.
So those are the strengths that a D might bring to a group. What are some growth areas that if somebody is tending toward D, and then as you said, the higher you are on that, the more you have to be aware of maybe that shadow side. What are some growth areas that a D might need to be aware of in that self-awareness?
So growth areas could be, again, this could be, cross out the ones that don't apply to you. They can be domineering. They sometimes can't relax, really hard drivers. They may offend others. So Ds tend to be very direct communicators, and the types that aren't direct communicators may be very offended by Ds. They can appear cold. They may struggle apologizing. They may be impatient, and they may be domineering. The other thing that's really important with each type is their greatest fear, because if we know the greatest fear of a type, then we can avoid being a trigger when we are communicating with them. So the greatest fear of the D is being taken advantage of.
Interesting. So, okay, the may struggle apologizing. That's also interesting. Thinking about it in relational context. And okay.
Yes. Well, so Ds tend to be big. So they are often, again, they're 3% of the population. So they are less common, which means people aren't as used to them. Number one. 2, women struggle who are strong Ds because people struggle with really domineering women. Right. Which is not a them problem. Is that they bring a lot of strengths to the table. It's more about the rest of us that are interacting with them. We're not used to women being that dominant. And then the third thing is they are often the CEOs. They are often the ones leading beautiful nonprofits in the world, or going in to, justice causes around the world because they are strong enough to do it. So Ds are beautiful, strong leaders, and you often find them leading the helm.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, let's move on to I.
Okay. Is are 11% of the population. It's interpersonal is the name.
Interpersonal is the I. Okay, 11%. So a little more than 3. But we're still only dealing between the two with 14% of the population. So a little more, but interpersonal, what does that mean? That sounds nice.
Yeah. So think of someone in your circle of family, friends, or colleagues who is fun to be with, who can tell great stories, that captures your attention, and that tends to be the glue. So that's one of the descriptors of Is that I really love is they are the culture builders. They're the cheerleaders. They're the glue of any group. So they're persuasive. They're spontaneous. They're friendly. They don't mind the spotlight. They are often very generous and charismatic. They're friendly. They're talkative. They're creative. They inspire others. They're very charming, and they're very likable. So those are some of the characteristics of Is. Their growth areas are they may waste time. They may talk too much. They may be undisciplined. They may be disorganized, naive, distracted, impulsive. And to some types, especially, they may appear phony because we'll get into that a little bit when we start talking about how the types interact. But to some types, they may appear just not as genuine. So I can see. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I can see within a group setting how they might be kind of the center of attention, but lack that directness that a D would have, where a D would be like, okay, cut to the chase. This is what we're doing. And I might be a little more like, hey, let's do this in a really fun way and get everybody to do it. But it's not seen as such a direct, maybe bossy approach.
Totally. Right.
Okay.
Because the goal of the I is to unify the group. So they're always going to be about unity, fun. And they're people over task. D's are task over people. So that's a big difference. That's a huge difference. D's will always want to go to task, and well, people are secondary. I's will always choose people. So my highest is an I. And I will say, I will never sacrifice people for task. So what I do, and this is not a good habit, it's something I'm really working on, but I will prioritize people and then stay up all night getting my task done because I'm secondary D. So I still want to do the task, but I'm never going to sacrifice people for it because I is my primary. If that makes sense. The greatest fear of the I is rejection or loss of approval.
Okay. Okay. They love their people.
Yeah. I mean, and I will say, and we'll talk a little more about this in the future, but I will say, if you don't have an I in the group will know because the group is not unified. So I's are so important in a workplace, in, just any group. You've got to have that I, or the group probably isn't going to be unified. Okay, let's talk about S's.
Yeah. S's. Okay. What does S stand for?
Steady.
Steady. Okay.
They are 69% of the population.
Okay. Yeah. So they're the Enneagram 6s, which are the majority of the population as well, right?
Yeah. So S's are loyal, they're helpful, and they can always be relied on to follow through. So they're team-oriented and they have a high level of acceptance of others. They're hard workers, they're team players, they're secure, stable, they're sentimental, they're savers. They tend to be reserved. They prefer close friendships over large groups of people. They're faithful. They find the easy way. They're great listeners. They are great mediators. They're peaceful and they're routine oriented.
Sounds familiar. Okay. So since we're using me as an example, I think I scored pretty high on this one, above the energy line, as we say in the DISC.
Yes.
Okay. So that sounds familiar. And just thinking about what a huge percent of the population this is. This is most people. We're talking about most people here, over 2/3 of the population. Yes. So most people are team players and steady and stable. So they're kind of the nuts and bolts of a group, probably.
Yes. So they are what we like to call, they're just one of the foundational pieces of a group. They're really a steadying force in a group. So again, S's are people over task. So they're still people over task. Unlike the I, they're not the cheerleaders. Okay. They're not the upfront cheerleaders. They are the supporters. So they're more that kind of foundational piece in a group. So they're much more behind the scenes. They're much more kind of reserved, but they still are people oriented. So that's important to know. The other thing I didn't bring up that I need to is how people process. So I's and D's are fast processors. They move quickly. They think quickly. They want to make decisions quickly. S's and C's, and we'll get to the C's in a second, are slow processors. So they do not make decisions quickly. They think slowly, and they have to be given time to think before they speak. So for example, I'll just give my husband, I'll throw him under the bus right now. So he is an S, highest is S, and birthday cards. I'm like, quick, sign the birthday card. like, like we're going to we got to go out and they're here and sign the birthday card. And he's like, oh, because he wants to really think about what he's going to say in the birthday card. So I have learned I have to give him the birthday card the night before so that he can really think through it and decide what he wants to say. Whereas I'm just like, sign the birthday card, and because I could. So that's like the birthday card example is a prime example of a fast processor versus a slow processor.
Okay. So growth areas for an S. We talked
growth
about
areas,
strengths, but yes,
can be too laid back, really slow to change, slow to start, slow paced.
I'm getting a theme here. Yes. Okay.
They often have a difficulty saying no. They shut down often in confrontation. They need reassurance. They're not always direct, and they can be indecisive, and they may not speak up because of that fear of confrontation. So their greatest fear is loss of security and confrontation.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that feels very, very familiar. And like looking at these as someone who identifies with this type, the hard worker and the growth areas, there are a lot of those that I'm like, yeah, that's totally me. And there are some that I'm like, I mean, maybe sometimes that might be my tendency, but it's not something I really struggle with. So for each of us, as we're listening to these, and remember that, what did you say? You get to boss the assessment around.
No, that's what I'm saying. You get to boss the test. Cross out the ones that don't apply to you.
But I do think even that is an indicator, right? Like if you're comfortable bossing the test around versus not comfortable bossing the test around, that might be an indicator, because okay.
Let's talk C's.
Let's talk C's. The last one. What does C stand for?
C's that stands for compliant.
Okay.
So C's are always on time. Their desk, their home, and even their garage is very organized. And they might even have labels. They are 17% of the population.
Okay.
So they're I would say S's are the most popular type. C's are next. And they're planners. They're accurate. They're analytical. They're genius prone. They demand a high quality work. They are organized. They're data driven. It's really important about C's. They are data driven. They want the data, and they will not move unless they have the data. They finish what they start. They gather facts. They're deep thinkers. They're serious. They carry out work correctly. They're planners. They are planners. They have to have a plan. Did I say they were genius prone? Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
So they're the more analytical type. So they're often in computer science. They're often in deep research. They're the ones that love to do deep dives into any information. And so when you have, let's say, a project that requires some depth of knowledge, you put a C on the task. That is who you want on your team. Growth areas, they can be moody. They can be critical, socially insecure, rigid, legalistic. They overanalyze. They can appear cold and distant, like the D's. They prefer to work alone. They're the ones that groan when the teachers would say, it's time for group work. They'd be like, oh no, the eyes are cheering. They're hard to please. They can be slow to start, like the S's. They can have analysis paralysis. So they have just, and for C's, sometimes they can just need too much information. Like there's never enough data. So, that they have to at some point stop researching. They may not see the big picture. They avoid risk. So they're risk averse, and they can be perfectionists. And their greatest fear is criticism.
Okay. Interesting.
So again, like let's say let's talk about combinations for just a second. So everyone is at least two types. So in a normal graph, I would say in general, there's two above the energy line and two below the energy line. So as you're listening, you may say, I have some tendencies of that one. And that's probably true. So like my dominant combination is an I dominant, D secondary. Yours was an S dominant, C secondary, and you had a little bit of I, tiny bit above the energy line. So you also can have three above the energy line, but normally your third one is just barely above the energy line. It means you have just a touch of it, but not a ton. So that is how the combinations work.
Okay. Do there tend to be opposites? Like, would you have an I and a C above the energy line?
Yes, but that is again probably a rare combination. So if someone had an I and a C, I'd be like, ooh, that's an interesting combination. Because so often,
because they sounded opposite to me
when
I was listening to the description.
So often the types that conflict the most, and we'll get into this more later, but the types that can conflict the most are I's and C's and D's and S's. And there's reasons for that. And we can get into that more later, but that would be a rare combination.
Yeah.
Whereas it's more common to see like an I and like I's and S's often go together. D's and C's often go together. My sister is a combination of I and C, and that's an interesting combination.
Okay. So, what else do we need to know about the DISC before we start talking like specific scenarios and how things work out?
Well, so I each letter has certain things that come with it. So for D's, how high or low you are, or how high or low you are on D, that tends to be how you go toward problems and challenges. So the higher the D you are, the more directly you take on problems and challenges. The lower the D you are, the more softly you take on problems and challenges. And maybe the more you avoid problems and challenges. So for example, a company that I worked with, they were really high in S's and C's, very low in I's and D's. Well, they had some serious problems happening, but they were kind of avoiding those. Well, that's because they're low on D. And so they don't have anyone really tackling the problem head on, if that makes sense.
Meaning on their leadership team.
On their leadership team.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I's tend to be how we deal with people and contacts. So how we experience the people we experience is how I like to say it. So the higher you are on I, the more you're going to be in tune with the people and contacts, and same, everything is the reverse, the lower you are. S's really describe how we move toward pace and consistency. So the higher the S, the more you're going to actually keep that consistent pace going. And the lower, that's true, less true. And then C is how we move toward procedures and constraints. Does that help a little bit with the categories?
Yeah, I think that does. And as we start to think about application in different arenas, we can start thinking about how those indicators, so above the energy line, would be, oh, this is a person who's really strong in the people area. And so it would make sense to put this person in that direction. Okay, so let's start talking about how we interact. So that helps us with kind of self-awareness. But we need to interact in the world with other people. right? That have different numbers than we do, or letters than we do, and different combinations and different strength of combinations. Um, how do you suggest somebody who is listening start paying attention to the patterns? And then what are the questions they should be asking themselves as they're looking around at the people that they're working with? And let's just say, for conversation's sake, this is within the workplace. How would you suggest somebody start looking around and saying, okay, I'm making some observations. What else should she be asking herself?
Well, I think the two things we can ask without even knowing the disc, without knowing what other people's disc is we can say, does this person tend to be task over people or people over task? And that really helps you from just the get-go to say, okay, if this person is people over task, meaning they're the ones that, let's say, want to know what you did over the weekend and what the name of your children are. And right. So that means they value people and they want to for them to be happy in the workplace, they need to have relationships that feel real to them. So that may mean, let's say you're someone who's task over people. Again, we're not labeling these as good or bad. It's just how you're wired. Let's say that you are really task driven and you feel like that is a waste of time. Well, your challenge then would be to say, okay, I'm going to take 5 minutes and I'm going to actually talk to this person about their weekend, about their dog that, went to training school, about their child's soccer game. And that literally, that investment of 5 minutes, you have no idea how far that will go with that person. It will make them so much more loyal to you. It will make them so much more connected to you. It is going to make them a better person in the workplace. And we talk about employee retention all the time. I mean, I work with a lot of leadership teams and companies, and employee retention is real. So you train someone up, you spend all that money, all that time to train someone up. If they're not happy, they're going to leave. And guess what? Now you've just lost all that money, all that time, and you have to retrain someone else. And that takes a lot more time and money. So if you can keep that original person happy in the workplace, that benefits you even in your bottom line financially.
So that could cover a whole menu of activities that you could be in charge of as somebody who has leadership in the workplace. You can create lunchtime conversations. You can create after work events. You can create something where people's families are included, if that's what's important to them. Like the things that are important to people are that their people get recognized too. And so it may be, if you do a holiday dinner, that people are able to bring a guest rather than saying, no, we're just going to do it during lunchtime because we're all business around here. Now, what about...
And 69% of the population are S's. Remember that. And one of the things I've heard you say in your workplace is, I guess I'm just the kind of person who wants to show up as all of me and not have those boundaries around, like, telling people about my family or whatever. And I mean, how have you felt in that?
Yeah, I think I've had some self-awareness or realization as I've re-entered the workplace after working independently and with you for so long, that I really do want to share about my family, but I also want to know about other people and not just the task that we have to do together. It helps me. Okay, how about this? It helps me get the work done if I feel like I know the people I'm working with.
Case in point. That's literally exactly that investment of time relationally pays dividends on the tasks.
So what if it's reversed? What if you are all about the people and you're working with some people who are like, I am here to work. I'm not here to share with you about the new kittens at my house. That's for my family, or that's for my church group. So how do you give them what they need.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's where it's so helpful when everyone is equipped with the DISC, because you're actually working mutually to consider others, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but what you can say is, okay, I normally would spend 20 minutes talking to this person about my family or my feelings about something, whatever. And they're more task oriented, they're probably in the D or the C category,
Mm-hmm.
then you say, I'm going to cut this short. I'm only going to tell them one thing and I'm going to tell it quickly. And then I'm going to let them move on with their day.
Mm-hmm. Does it help to preemptively have a conversation? Like if you're leading a meeting, for example, and there are people who need some of that chit chat, some of that connection glue time, to say, we're going to take 5 minutes and focus on this. And then we're going to move on to the other tasks at hand for the meeting. Is that helpful?
Yes, that is
Okay.
very helpful. And what you can do is with putting that time limit on it is, I think, really respecting the other types,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also allowing only the types that need that to share and to feel that. And then the ones that are task over people probably don't even feel like they need to share. And then they don't have to,
Mm-hmm.
and that's okay too. Like
Mm-hmm.
giving people freedom in that.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the other thing that we can really pay attention to, we talk about task over people, but we also need to talk about that processing piece that I brought up at the beginning, the fast processors versus the slow processors.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things you hit on, Alex, that is really critical, again, S's are 69% of the population. If they feel pushed
Mm-hmm.
in any way, doesn't matter what it is, they will kick on their brakes and they will come to a halt because they're feeling pushed instead of being invited into the process in a way that feels comfortable to them. And so we have to, if you are a fast processor, you have to respect that you can't just ask them to sign the birthday card 3 minutes before it's needed.
Mm-hmm.
If you are a slow processor, you also have to respect that you may spend way too much time processing and you need to not spend all day. You need to put a time limit on it and be able to say things like, I need 2 hours
Mm-hmm.
or I need 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll give you an answer.
Mm-hmm.
But again, as we're looking at, like, for people that don't even know the DISC, how do we just start identifying these things in the workplace? Well, you probably know whether that person you're working with is a fast or slow processor. Do they want to move quickly or do they move too slowly, in your opinion? And then how can you kind of come to a middle ground in that?
Mm-hmm.
How has
Yeah.
that helped you?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of some practical ways that I have navigated that with other people, and recognizing that I need some thought time, or I feel like if we bring up a topic and make a decision within the same meeting, that have we really looked at everything? I'm always worried we're missing something. Have we thought this through? We can't just jump in and start. We need to make sure that this is the right path. And I know I can do that on some things for years. And so it isn't helpful to just not have a time limit. So giving people, I think, deadlines. By tomorrow at 10 o'clock, we need to have a decision on this. Can you give me a decision? That allows, I think, for both ends of the spectrum to get what they need. For the people who are ready to move, to get that going, and for the people who need a little more time to know, I'm going to have my time, but it's not forever. And that is helpful, I think, because when we were looking at the kind of the areas of growth that S's might have, it is picking up the pace a little bit. And I'm just thinking of a decision that didn't have anything to do with anybody else in my office last week. I was the one who had the final call, and I did not know what to do. And I could argue it both ways till Sunday, and I knew that. And my boss, who is so wise, and was like, well, have fun with that. But I also knew I had a deadline. I had to make that decision by the end of the day. And so the self-awareness of saying, this is good for me. This is good for me to have to make this decision today, because if I didn't have a deadline, I would avoid it because I don't like it. I don't like either option here. So I think it's just helpful in the self-awareness, even when you're not dealing with other people, but then you can apply some of these. Give space for a limited amount of time when you're working with a team that probably has both ends of the spectrum represented.
And I would love to even talk about our combination, because I am ID, you are SC. We are literally opposites, right? And there is so much power in questions. And I think we forget that when we're working with each other, there's just a lot of power. And one of the things that I've learned after the DISC, that's where the DISC has been so helpful. After the DISC, I have learned to say to you, are we ready to make a decision? Are we ready to move forward? And that has given you freedom. I mean, how has that felt on the other end? Because I quickly move to decisions, and a lot of times I need to slow down. And then you're the opposite. You a lot of times need to speed up with decisions. And so I feel like we've kind of come to this really healthy, great place, largely because of the DISC, where I can say, are you ready? And then you get to tell me if you are or you aren't.
And I can identify, I'm not ready because this is the information I still need.
Yes.
That gives me the chance to articulate what I need in order to make the decision.
Yes.
And then that's helpful, because then that means we haven't covered it to the point. Maybe sometimes you're like, well, one, we're never going to get that information, or two, I feel like we've covered it, but at least it helps with the communication to be able to say that. And the other thing I think with us in particular that has been helpful is that somewhere along the line, I heard that because I am so high S, I need to know the why behind a decision.
Yes.
And so being able to identify that in myself helps me know what's going to help me move forward. So, and again, that's just in my own operation of making decisions, but it then gives me a tool to say, okay, I need to know the why. And if I don't know the why, this is the information I need in order to be able to look at everything and make the decision. So that has been helpful too. And I've been able to more clearly say, I need to know why. And you know why I'm saying I need to know why.
Yes. Right. And you know what I love about it is it takes out that personal offense that may occur. Like, I don't think you're questioning me. And maybe, and that's where I love using us as an example because we are opposites. And I think we're a great team. We're a really, really effective team together. And to me, this is like what you want people operating in their strengths. And one of the things that it has helped me with is when you say, why are we doing that? Or why are we, let's say that we're even deciding who to interview for a particular episode. And you say, why is this, serving the audience this way? Or why is this topic, why are we coming at it from this perspective? You're not questioning me and what I'm saying. You're just asking literally out there, why, the big why. And so do you see how I'm hoping listeners can get a feel for how this works in real life? Like I get to say, oh yeah, that's a great point. Let's discuss that why, instead of be offended that you're somehow questioning what I want to do.
Yeah. That it puts it outside of us and says, this is just how I'm wired. That's just how I'm wired. Okay. We've started to touch on a little bit how each of these types can play out in the workplace. And I would love to go through the 4 types and talk about if a woman is kind of hearing herself, or she goes and takes the assessment and comes back and listens again and knows that she is strong in one of these areas, how she can use that for the benefit of her team within the workplace. So let's really kind of clinch down on an office environment or a work environment where she is a leader, and maybe she's not a leader by position, but just because she's a smart woman and she
Mhm.
wants to exert some leadership within the workplace in a way that feels appropriate, professional, respectful of everyone.
Mm.
Let's talk about those 4 types and maybe what they need to be aware of within a group dynamic in that way. Does that sound okay?
Awesome. Let's do it.
Okay, so let's start with D. So D clearly is the person that when we think kind of stereotypical leader, we may think of a D. Is that true?
Yes.
Somebody who's ready to make decisions, the buck stops here kind of person. So let's assume for conversation's sake that we're talking about a woman and she is a D. So she may already know, like, I'm thinking of someone with that is a mutual friend of ours who I would think of as a D. And she has always said, like, I always have felt like I don't fit
Mhm.
because I don't fit in female circles and men don't always know exactly what to do with me. So here she is in the workplace, very direct personality. What does she need to be aware of as she's leading others?
Well, she needs to be aware, first of all, as a D, that you are not too much. I want to say this to the Ds,
Mhm.
to the D women out there. You are not too much. You are as much as God made you to be. So please do not diminish
Mm.
because you are only in 3% of people in the world.
Mhm.
And of those 3%, there's even a much, I don't know how many are women, but it's
Mhm.
much reduced for
Mhm.
females. So you are not too much and you are needed. You are needed to drive forward and to drive groups forward. It is important that you lead. What happens, especially with women who are Ds, is they feel like they have to pull back all the time because they feel like they're offending people all the time by being too dominant. And
Mhm.
I just want to give you permission that this is actually the strength that you bring to the table, is that you are a leader. You are a strong leader. You have strong shoulders. So that is the first thing that I want to say to a D female. The other thing that I want to say is you do have to be aware of how you're impacting people around you. You are big energy in a space. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be any less than what you are, but ask good questions and
Mhm.
be aware that not everyone is like you. And I just want to say, like, I'm secondary D, so I get this dynamic.
Mhm.
And I have often felt like I had to pull back, but that's not what we need to do, because the gift we bring to the table is that we drive groups forward, and we are initiators, and we are people who can get things done, and we're courageous. We're not afraid. We're not afraid and fearful. And so that's a strength. But in knowing that strength, be also aware that can come across sometimes as maybe cold or not considering what other people in the room have to bring to the table. And so get really good at asking questions and get really good at slowing your pace, because your pace is always going to be to drive quickly. And you just have to be aware that that may not be the best way forward. In fact, S's and C's may keep you from going bankrupt.
Mhm. Right. So I'm thinking of the S, the me in the room, who is 2/3 of your team,
Mhm.
and knowing the why. I am willing to follow a leader, but I
Mhm.
want to know, even if the decision is different than the one
Mhm.
I would make,
Mhm.
if I know that there is a strong reason behind it.
Yep.
So I would say sharing your reasoning, taking enough time, because you're a fast processor, taking
Mhm.
enough time to help the rest of the room catch up to your
Yep.
thinking by explaining it.
Love it.
And that may
Yes.
feel like a waste of your time. I get it.
Mhm.
I get it. And I also feel like that would be an asset to you if you do that, my D
Yes.
who are listening.
Yeah, and that's why we need each other. Again, one
Mhm.
type is not, I'm just going to say over and over, but I feel like I do have to repeat it. One type is not better than the other. The D is not better than the S, and the S is not better than the D. They are meant to work together and to bring both of their strengths to the table to create a more successful outcome. So Yes, the why is actually very important. And for the D's to slow down and be able to name it, that benefits everyone. And then ultimately, it benefits the S for the D to drive the project forward.
Yes.
So that is where like the synergy can
Mhm.
happen. And truly, it's where you and I have found such a good rhythm. I mean, I feel like that's why we are a good example of this, because I think we do help each other instead
Mhm.
of being in conflict about those things. I think we help each other come to a good place where we're ready to, in a healthy way, move forward.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about the I.
Okay.
The I as a leader in a room. She is warm, she's fun. She probably, for the people over task people, she gets it done as far as building that camaraderie and that teamwork. What does she need to be aware of as she is leading a team in the workplace? Are there boundary issues? I would think maybe sometimes she might overshare for if you're trying to keep things professional. Like, is walking that line between the personal and the professional difficult for her?
Well, I always want to start with the strengths of what she
Uh-huh.
brings to the table. So let's start there. I want to start with what the I needs to know about herself in the workplace is that she is vital to team culture. She is vital to building the culture. And if she is not there, there is a massive void. And that company will have retention problems. They will. She is the glue. And so to really own that, I think sometimes the I feels like, why aren't people getting on board? Why
Mhm.
doesn't everyone want to do the Valentine's boxes on the desks and everyone put Valentines in each other's boxes?
Uh-huh.
Why are people not getting on board? Do not be discouraged by that. You actually need to be the one to put Valentines on people's boxes, and people will
Mhm.
appreciate it. And ultimately, they will benefit from it. So sometimes eyes can feel like, why is no one getting on board? It's okay. Push through that because you are needed. You are the cheerleader. You are the glue. So be that glue and don't be discouraged by other people not participating would be my encouragement. You are needed. The pom poms need to come out because you need
Mhm.
some. Every group needs the pom pom girl. So you are it. What they need to be aware of. One, that they don't track well with verbal conversations. So you may think an I is completely understanding what you're saying because they are in the moment, they're tracking, but always follow up with I's in writing because they need to have something written down because they probably forgot 10 minutes later everything you talked about. So they don't tend to have that concrete, like, oh, I'm taking it away. So just follow up with them in writing. Eyes can tend to talk too much. They're the ones that when they were growing up in class, their teachers wrote talks too much on the report
Mhm.
card. So you do, as an eye, have to dial it back. People do need to get their tasks done, and you may have to pull back a little bit. You may spend too much time in meetings talking,
Mhm.
and people really need you to wrap it up and get going on their day. So that awareness piece of you may put people over task a little too much. The other thing eyes are notorious for, and I speak to this from experience, is they're not very protective of their own personal boundaries that can
Mhm.
really get them to burn out. So they sacrifice sleep, they sacrifice their own needs. They often don't identify their own needs. And so being aware that you may tend toward burnout if you don't get really in touch with boundaries around what you need.
Mhm. Yeah. So the flip side of that, if you are to follow up with an I on writing, if you are an I, something you might say is, "Could you email me that? I love
Yes.
that idea. Could you email me that?"
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I love eyes. Eyes are fun.
Mhm.
Fun. Um, okay, let's go to the S, the majority.
Mhm.
Um, what do S's? So S's maybe aren't labeled as the leader in the room. And yet, as 2/3 of the population, probably a lot of people in decision-making positions are S's just by the
Mhm.
fact that they're hard workers and they follow through and they show up to work every day. So if you're an S and you're leading a team of people, and you may tend towards being indirect or not pushing things forward, or shuts down in confrontation, and you're managing somebody who's a real direct communicator who doesn't mind confrontation, what are some things that S's need to be aware of as they are in positions of leadership at work?
Okay. Well, again, let's start with the strengths of an S. So what S's bring to the table that I really want you S's to lean into is you are those foundational blocks. You are the one that holds the team together in a different way than the I does. The I is more, like I said, the cheerleader, pom-pom carrier. The S's are the behind the scenes bedrock. So that is a really beautiful stability in an organization. So sometimes S's feel like, well, I'm not flashy enough, or I'm not out there enough, or I'm like, what I's and D's may feel too much. C's and S's may feel too little. And so I just want to say to the S's, you are not too little. You are exactly who you need to be. You are a stabilizing force. You are dependable. You are loyal, and you are kind. And that makes people trust you. So you create a safe environment for groups, and you make a great leader because of that. So want to start there. S's may do a few things that can hold a team back a little bit. And that is one, and we've already talked a little bit about these, but they can stay in process too long, and they need to pick up the pace. So pacing is a good thing. S's like pace. They like consistent pace. You just may need to pick up the pace a little bit. The other thing is, whereas D's are, like you said, really direct communicators, S's are very indirect. And where that can harm is especially in conflict. So conflict is a huge piece of the workplace. And the longer that we wait to address a conflict, the more toxic a work environment becomes. And so my encouragement to S's is really whatever you need to do, whether it's telling yourself it's only 2 minutes of hard conversation and then it gets better, like little tools to kind of help you. And I'd love to hear from your perspective what's helped you. But one of the greatest disservices to a group, and S sometimes leans into, is not addressing conflict quickly enough. And then unfortunately, the culture really suffers. And then your employee retention is going to suffer. And so their slow to action really does harm ultimately the group if they're not aware of it. So I don't feel like that's you. You've done a great job of, I think, growing in that, knowing your tendencies. So how have you done that?
Well, I do think the idea that it's going to get worse if we don't deal with it now is a motivator, because I don't want a really bad conflict. So
yeah,
a little conflict sounds better than a really bad conflict. And I think that's true. And if you're supervising somebody, it's just going to be better to say, hey, I would really like to see you do this differently next time, the first time or second time it happens, rather than the 10th time, because then that's confusing too. And we want, and clear is kind. So I think that can help us, because we want to be kind people, to remember that clarity is kind. And so when I am thinking about hard conversations, sometimes I ask myself, what's going to honor the other person the most? And usually that means some clarity, and it might mean some direct communication that I wouldn't normally choose. I wonder if S's tendency is, because we're loyal and we want to create that place of safety, that we try to overcompensate for others when things are not going well. And then that actually, we can't control the group dynamic. We can only control ourselves. So then we try to over control what's happening here. And so to recognize that sometimes we have to take some leadership, and we have to be a little bit more bossy than what feels comfortable to us in order to direct a group in a certain situation. And it is difficult. It doesn't feel natural. And yet what doesn't feel natural to us as far as direct directives just feels like regular leadership to the rest of the group. So
Mhm.
to recognize that though we may be screaming inside, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm being so bossy, other people are like, oh, okay, she's saying clearly what she wants us to do. So it may not be received in the same way that we are feeling it as far as our own discomfort.
That's a really good point. And one that I think is really important. You and I talk a lot about Priya
Mhm.
Parker's book, The Art of Gathering. And one of the things she says in there is that when you are clear about how you want the group to operate, or a question you want them to answer, or whatever it is, wherever you're gathering, that is a gift to the group, because
Mhm.
every group needs structure. They have to have structure to thrive. So that, I think, is a great reminder of the why. For the
Mhm.
S's of the
Yep.
why is actually when you lead well and you give directives to the group, or you provide a space for feedback, so that, like, let's say you have a regular time every week for your team to give feedback, so that there can be those addressing those small confrontations that are small now, maybe big later. That is actually a gift to the group. That is
Mhm.
actually a well-functioning group. So if you think of the why behind it, that fuels doing it.
Mhm. Yeah, and that decision that I referenced earlier from last week, what I actually did was I thought, okay, what would Priya Parker tell me to do? Because it had to do with impacting the whole group. One
Mm,
person was asking for an exception, and I was like, no, I need to think about what the purpose of the group is, what the
mm.
purpose of the gathering is, and why I made that decision in the first place. And we're not going to make an exception. And that was hard because for me, I love people and I don't want conflict. I wanted to say, well, it's fine with me. It's okay. But I was thinking on behalf of the group, and that helped with my decision making.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really good example. The other thing I will say as leaders is, this is where you talk about communication between the types, but S's tend to give more information than other types really want or need. And so, like, you may notice that when you're talking to a D, their eyes glaze over and they start to, like, check out. Well, that's because D's want bullet points.
Mhm.
S's want the full explanation, but D's are like, just give me the top 3 bullet points and off we go. So, all of this stuff as leaders is really important, because then that means an S who's in leadership, you may want to talk around something for 15 minutes, and it literally, for a D, would require a 1-minute bullet point conversation. So
Mhm.
learning how to finesse that, because you will see D's and some I's, check out because it feels too slow.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, C, the final.
Okay.
What happened there?
We froze for a second.
Okay.
All right. C's,
Okay. C's, the final group.
the final group. C is what I want to tell you is, as a leader, your capacity for research and thinking through everything that needs to be thought through for that project is so vital. It's so important. And what you bring to the table as far as your organization, your clarity, your analysis, that all is very beneficial to the group. And so sometimes you may feel like you're boring people. C's often feel like, oh, I'm boring people with all of these
Mhm.
details. And that may happen, but actually the group needs that. They need a certain amount of, let's say, depth to that project. And you are offering that as a leader. So that is the strength you bring to the table. What you have to be aware of as a C is you have to recognize that probably it will never be enough for you to have, you will always want to do more, perfect something more. So let's say you're writing, let's say you're writing a book and you're a C. You will probably never want to turn in the manuscript ever, because it will never be good enough. You will always be able to do more. So just know that you have an insatiable appetite for data and depth in your work. And at some point, you just got to cut it off and call it good. The other thing that with a C is that you really can get analysis paralysis, because you are over analyzing over and over and over again. And at some point, again, you just got to choose to move, because sometimes it's when we're in motion that we actually find out the answer. So you can't just stay forever in indecision about something, because you may not get that decision until you start moving. So that would be the other thing I would say to the C. And then also I would say to the C that you can tend to be really rigid in your systems. And that can be really suffocating for other people who don't need that rigid of systems. And so you can appear very, I was just talking to someone in the workplace the other day, and they just feel like the C in their group is micromanaging, trying to micromanage every single thing and every person. So then people start to feel really controlled, when really the C is just trying to keep all the systems going. They're trying to keep all their systems, because that makes them feel in control. And they've set it up that way because it works well. But then as a byproduct, that makes other people feel really controlled, and that feels suffocating to them.
I would think a lot of C's would rise to leadership because they're the expert in their field,
right?
Because they have done excellent work, and now they are trying to figure out how to bring other people along to their level of excellence. And recognizing that people operate differently may be a little bit hard. And then also, it sounds like it would be helpful to have deadlines created, that we just have to move forward with this by December 2nd.
Yes.
No matter where we are. And because you are a C, you are going to do great work to try to meet that deadline. But then it's saying, okay, this is where we are at this point, and now we're going to move on to the next step. And that methodical element of here's our plan with these steps might actually help us move things along within the way that we're wired.
Yeah. And I also want to say, remember, C's are task over people. So they are going to not have a tendency to focus on relationships. And if you have a CD combination, which is often paired, is that CD, that's tough on people. Because that CD combination, you're not only kind of uncompromising in your systems, but now you're hard driving in them. And that is going to leave a relational disaster if you're not checking yourself, because that means you're not slowing down for people, and you're not recognizing that people are humans and they need that human touch. So for someone who might be that CD combination, that's just like a common pitfall that they can fall into.
Okay. Well, I feel like this has been very, very helpful and practical, and we would love to hear how you are using this information in your own life, and especially at work, if this is helpful. And of course, Krista is available to help you if you have a team that wants to work through this, or if you individually want to work through this. She is prepared to do that. She is an expert in this and can really walk people through the assessment and what that means together. So, thank you, Krista. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. And we are looking forward to hearing how people are using this. And go be yourself fully while being aware.
Yeah, exactly. It is so true, isn't it? It's like celebrating who you are and also being really aware of the things that may really not be good with a group.
Yes. And that's the tension. That's the tension of leadership, is knowing this is where I tend to fall, and this is what the group needs from me. And so I'm going to balance those two as I communicate and make decisions. Okay. Well, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I love it. Bye.
Bye.